Perhaps one of the most traumatic aspects of the COVID-19 crisis has been the situation of workers in garment supply chains. As major brands and retailers cancelled an estimated $40 billion in production orders, even for products already made, millions of garment workers across the world were left without any income and faced a severe food crisis.
It became clear to us organizationally beginning in mid-March that brands and retailers were responding to the rapid decline in apparel demand by trying to push the economic pain of the crisis down the supply chain onto suppliers and workers, specifically by refusing to honor their financial obligations to suppliers for apparel that they had asked suppliers to make, that suppliers and workers had in fact made or were in the process of making, but that brands had decided it was no longer in their interest to buy.
I think for the Clean Clothes Network, which at the moment is encompasses about 200 trade unions, NGOs, civil society groups organized in regional coalitions in Asia. One of the first things we did was to try and say, look, we need to make as visible as we can what is going on and how this is impacting garment workers. So we started a live blog, and that we continue to update daily, and try to organize ourselves within the network into, a bunch of several working groups that are meeting online weekly to work through the regions and through the partners to try both to document what is happening and to pull together a set of demands on what we felt was the most urgent response that was needed to the crisis. And then out of that sort of start campaigning as best as we can. A big part of that has been, as Scott describes, to join with others in the Pay Up campaign, which is trying to at least get money owed to employers so that they can, in theory, meet their obligations to workers.
I mean, we really want to get into the conversation of looking into the future in terms of what needs to be done, and perhaps starting with the regulations. So looking forward, what does the ability of brands to just evoke force majeure, act of God, cancel orders without any consequences teach us in terms of what needs to happen in global supply chains going forward?
I think the ability of brands and retailers to initially get away with reneging on their financial and contractual commitments illustrates the depth of the inequities that define global supply chain relationships, not just between brands and employers and workers, but between brands and their suppliers. And often the inequities in that set of relationships manifest themselves in consequences for workers. The only reason a supplier would sign a contract with a brand that allows the brand to cancel the order after the supplier has already paid and workers have already done the work to produce it is if the supplier has no choice. And what this demonstrates is the fundamental need for reform in the structure of supply chain relationships, not just at the level of the workplace, but between the brands and retailers and their suppliers. Reform of the very nature of the way in which brands and their suppliers interact financially. One obvious reform is altering a system of payments in which the supplier incurs all of the upfront cost of producing goods, in which the supplier is essentially subsidizing the cash flow of its customers. So that system needs to be changed to one in which it's the entities in the system with the greatest financial resources, the greatest financial flexibility, and the greatest access to capital who need to bear the bulk of the cash flow burden, meaning brands and retailers have to pay for most of the goods up front. That would be enormously advantageous for suppliers and ultimately for workers, even outside of the scope of an immediate crisis. For example, it would greatly reduce instances of workers' wages not being paid on time because of cash flow crises suffered by their employer.
You can't resolve that only at the employer level. It's overly simplistic to think, brands need to pay a sum that is sufficient, and then we need to regulate employers because then employers will, be forced to pay for those costs. Because what happens in the supply chain is at that very moment, if you treat it like that, still sort of 20th century logic, you see the supply chain shifting. Companies will move, countries will compete with each other. So I think theoretically the COVID-19 crisis could give an opportunity to think about regulating the commercial terms, the labor terms, and the relations between. I think there is some interest from the governmental side. If you look at what's happening in Europe around mandatory human rights due diligence, or EU directive. At the same time, it's hard to be optimistic about it, because if you see what's happening in reality with the predictions of a 30% level of job loss and a restructuring of the industry in such a massive way, where at the moment labor is quite powerless, you know, to really bring about that complex regulation that we need at these different levels.
Thank you. Marlies, I mean, you come to this also from your legal background, and it's the trickiest issue of all. You're mentioning in some ways we have to accept this degree of informality, but it doesn't mean that that's absent regulation, right? I mean, how are you, WeGo, thinking of this issue of social protection and so on, and you know, reflecting on the crisis to rethink regulation for supply chains from the top to the very bottom?
If I think in terms of at a national level, I think the challenge is that we do have to transcend this binary of employment relation of an employee and independent contractor. Because if you look across Asia, many of the countries have extended the notion of employee to include some forms of informality. So, for example, fixed-term contracts or casual contracts, but it's often a little bit piecemeal, where they'd be entitled to some labor rights but not social protection, for example, or something else. So we really have to transcend that and engage with the concept of worker. All workers, irrespective of their status of employment, should be entitled to the same rights, including collective bargaining rights and including social protection. And if I could just touch on, what Ineke and Scott have raised in terms of the legislation at the global level, and particularly the opportunity now with the directive at the EU level that's on mandatory due diligence that's likely to come about in 2021. I mean, I think it seems like an opportunity, but it's still not tackling the procurement terms, right?
If you can regulate employers at the national level, you can regulate employers at the international level. Problem, of course, is that we've chosen not to do that. I mean, one interesting exception is the U.S. law, which is long-standing, but due to a large loophole, unimplementable until several years ago, that prohibits the importation into the U.S. of goods that are made with forced labor at any level of the supply chain. And what's interesting about that law is it applies across the supply chain, regardless of whether the production facility or work site engaged in forced labor is directly owned by the company in the U.S., the company importing into the U.S., or a contractor, regardless of the location of that workplace or work site. And the liability that the law creates, which is both criminal and civil, applies to the importing company and to the executives of the importing company, which is to say, under the law, the CEO of a U.S. apparel brand importing apparel into the U.S., or the CEO of a Swedish apparel brand that is selling product and importing it to the U.S. can go to jail as a result of acts of forced labor in the supply chain at contracted factories of that brand if the CEO knew or should have known that the forced labor was taking place. Now, we have not seen meaningful implementation of the law at the level of criminal prosecution, although the U.S. government has said there are criminal investigations underway. But one can imagine how quickly the labor practices of a brand or retailer would change if the CEO of that brand or retailer genuinely believed that she or he faced the prospect of jail time as a result of labor rights abuses at contracted factories globally, not just on the narrowly defined issue of forced labor, but other kinds of labor rights abuses, which could just as easily be made a basis of that kind of legislation.
We the other questions we sort of wanted to get to, words, and thank you for that, Scott, thank all of you, was sort of reflections on strategy and sort of what, lessons learned in this period, where so much has been achieved despite these difficult circumstances. I think we estimate maybe as much as 15 billion has been paid up, and as long as I've been doing this work, I don't know of anything of that scale. But so just any reflections on strategy, and then maybe bringing in this question of the wage assurance campaign, where that's at now.
I mean, the brands and retailers, even in the absence of meaningful legal liability, remain exquisitely reputationally vulnerable over their actions in the global supply chain, and the Pay Up campaign is a powerful illustration of this. And the reality is, once it became an issue of public debate and scrutiny as a result of the efforts of advocacy groups, researchers, the political dynamic rapidly shifted. Brands and retailers couldn't defend the practice. And as you've noted, Mark, billions of dollars in payments to suppliers that would otherwise never have been made have now been made. Probably in strictly financial terms, the biggest success of an advocacy campaign in the context of global apparel supply chains we've ever seen. Sadly, a success made possible only by the depth of the crimes the brands and retailers were committing. But nonetheless, what we learned from that experience is a lesson we've learned in other battles over the years. The brands are reputationally vulnerable. Fortunately, it's easier to use that leverage in the context of an immediate crisis or in response to a catastrophic event than it is to take that leverage and apply it to the long-term work of creating effective private regulation in the absence of public regulation. But still, the reputational vulnerability is there. We've won successes over the years utilizing that vulnerability. The Pay Up campaign is a very powerful illustration of both the existence of the vulnerability and how to exploit it effectively. And we need to do more of that more effectively, more strategically, more long-term.
I think we need to really be very, very clear that brands and retailers and employers, but brands and retailers, given their financial ability and how much they've profited in the supply chain and their role in the supply chain over the past 20 years, have not taken the measures that were necessary to safeguard any workers against this type of crisis. No severance methodology set up, no insistence on legislation, no money put aside in escrow account, no guarantee fund build-up anywhere outside of Europe, despite years of people making it very clear that all these measures are missing. So that is, in the terms of human rights due diligence and remedy, a massive failure, knowing full well what the risks were, what the human rights risks were, and what the measures were that they should have taken. So I think that wage theft, needs to be settled, and that's what the wage assurance is about, right? It's about really publicly saying to brands, look, we're now not talking about living wage. We're not talking about all the things that you need to get these people's human rights respected. We're actually really talking about the very minimum under legislation that they were supposed to get. Now, strategically, how do you get that money to the workers then? I mean, I think there is, as Scott's saying, we have to use public exposure here as much as we can. But we also have to build up towards the future as new orders are being placed, as some factories are reopening, and the wage assurance says, look, pay the gap of what is missing now, but also pay a premium over your future orders. So that's the future orders, that's affordable. That premium needs to be used to build up social protections in the country concerned and to pay out severance and back wages for workers who are losing their job.
Yeah, I mean, maybe just from the perspective of home workers and picking up on the wage theft, of course, the wage theft for home workers is the greatest of all. I mean, in countries, typically they're paid between a third to half the minimum wage. And I think, it's not good enough for brands to say, well, they're not covered by minimum wage legislation at the national level, because there are two international instruments that recognize that home workers are in fact disguised employment. I mean, the one is the ILO Convention 177 on homework, and the other is the OECD. I mean, that's a soft instrument, but the OECD guidance on the garment and footwear sector. It has a module on homework.
But also, if we would want to create a genuinely, an industry that genuinely has social protection, living wages, and safe work for all down the supply chain, and link that back to the kind of consumption levels that we can predict at the moment, what type of pricing do you then get? What would it take in, say, 10 years if you are saying, look, I want to have an industry, how many workers would need to be employed, in what type of business, and then do the costing, given that you can predict a bit what the consumption levels will be if it goes down, no longer this high fast fashion, because then we would have, as a movement, I think, the ability to say to people, look, you know, you can buy so many items a year, they're going to cost you more or less this amount, and then there will be a decent industry. You know, what linking those consumption figures and real genuine employment figures with what is happening in a supply chain could bring us campaignability, if you see what I mean. Because I think we need to give people a vision on what a decent industry would look like at both these levels.
It's coming up a lot now. People are questioning, you know, are we buying, you know, too many articles of apparel, and maybe there's this readjustment. At the same time, though, you look at the supply chain, hours of work. I mean, some of them have been saying for years you could take most jobs and turn them into 2. Yeah. If you're doing 80 hours a week at this humane pace of production, bring it to a humane pace of production, proper water, bathroom, coffee, lunch breaks, 8-hour workday, 5 days a week. We produce less you know, disposable apparel, and you actually have living wages and decent schedules of work without a significant drop in employment. We have to have a vision. We have to ask these bigger questions.
Production doubled in the last 15 years. If you would bring it back to 2000 levels, for example, you could, even if we would just have some scenarios, that would be, you know, beneficial for the planet to begin with. If you then regionalize the supply chains better, how many workers can you then, if you want to still keep employed the number of workers that we have now, but under a decent contract, right? So not working the 80 hours and so on. Then what does it mean for how much a garment, a t-shirt or jeans, or you could express it in labor minutes or however you want to do it, what would it need to cost? What would the true price be, and how would you need to structure it? We can't articulate that at the moment, largely because we have no real figures or data to work with.
Challenge of unions and other worker organizations is to figure out how to simultaneously marshal resources to ensure that workers can survive this immediate crisis, while also not losing sight of the fact that there are opportunities here to expand the range of what is possible in terms of the fundamental reforms that we've long known are needed to address the broad range of abuses and inequities across the global production system.